For most of the 20th century, the middle class represented stability, opportunity, and the belief that hard work could gradually build a comfortable life. A steady job, rising income, affordable housing, and the possibility of retirement created the foundation of what many people called the modern economic dream. Millions of families believed that if they worked consistently, saved money carefully, and avoided major financial mistakes, they would slowly climb toward a more secure and prosperous future. The middle class became the backbone of economic growth because their spending, housing purchases, and long-term investments powered entire industries. But over the last few decades, something unusual has started happening inside many developed economies. The middle class has not disappeared overnight, yet the financial stability that once defined it has gradually begun to weaken. Many households still earn what technically qualifies as middle-class income, yet the feeling of security that once came with that income has become far less certain. Rising costs, stagnant wages, and increasing financial pressure have slowly changed the economic reality for millions of families. For many people, the modern middle-class experience now feels very different from what previous generations expected. Instead of steadily building wealth, many households feel as if they are constantly trying to keep up with rising expenses. One of the most visible pressures comes from housing costs, which have increased dramatically across many cities and regions. What was once considered a basic step toward stability has become one of the largest financial challenges facing middle-class families today. In previous generations, purchasing a home often required significant savings, but the cost of housing relative to income was far more manageable. A single stable salary could sometimes support a mortgage payment while still leaving room for savings and everyday living expenses. Today the situation is often very different, because housing prices in many areas have grown much faster than the wages people earn. Even households earning solid middle-class incomes sometimes struggle to afford homes in the communities where they work. As a result, many families take on larger mortgages that stretch across decades and consume a greater portion of their monthly income. While home ownership remains a central goal for many people, the financial commitment required to achieve it has become much heavier. Housing is not the only cost rising faster than income. Education, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and daily living expenses have all increased steadily over time, creating a financial environment where middle-class households must allocate more of their income simply to maintain the same standard of living. When these costs rise simultaneously, families often find themselves facing difficult financial trade-offs. Saving for the future becomes harder when so much income is required just to cover the essentials of modern life. This is where the concept of the middle-class squeeze begins to appear. Income may still be growing slowly, but expenses are growing faster, gradually narrowing the financial space that once allowed families to build wealth. At the same time, wage growth in many industries has not kept pace with the rising cost of living. Workers may receive small raises over time, but those increases often fail to match the rapid expansion of housing, healthcare, and education expenses. When income growth lags behind the cost of living, households naturally begin relying on financial tools that allow them to maintain their lifestyle. Credit cards, auto loans, mortgages, and other forms of borrowing become essential bridges between income and expenses. Debt does not always appear immediately dangerous when it begins accumulating gradually. Monthly payments may seem manageable at first, especially when interest rates are relatively low and credit is widely available. But over time, those payments can grow into large financial commitments that last for many years. A mortgage may stretch across 30 years. Student loans may require decades of repayment, and credit card balances can quietly accumulate interest over long periods. When millions of households participate in this pattern simultaneously, their borrowing and repayment become part of a much larger economic engine. The financial obligations of the middle class create steady streams of payments that move through banks, lenders, and investment markets. From a broader economic perspective, middle-class borrowing has become one of the main drivers of consumption. Homes, cars, electronics, education, and countless other industries depend heavily on middle-class households continuing to spend. Consumer spending represents one of the largest components of modern economic activity. When middle-class families feel confident about their finances, they tend to spend more freely on housing, travel, education, and lifestyle upgrades. But when financial pressure increases, spending patterns begin to change. Families become more cautious, delaying major purchases and reducing discretionary expenses whenever possible. This shift can ripple through the entire economy because businesses depend heavily on middle-class consumption. Restaurants, retail stores, housing developers, and service industries all rely on millions of households continuing to participate in the market. When spending slows, businesses often respond by reducing expansion plans or slowing hiring. This creates a feedback loop where economic uncertainty leads to cautious spending, and cautious spending leads to slower economic growth. Another factor contributing to the middle-class crisis is the transformation of the labor market itself. Stable, long-term careers that once supported middle-class lifestyles have become less common in many industries. Automation, globalization, and technological change have altered the structure of employment in ways that make income more uncertain for many workers. While new opportunities have emerged, they do not always provide the same stability that previous generations experienced. Gig work, contract employment, and temporary jobs have become more common across various sectors of the economy. These forms of employment may offer flexibility, but they often lack the long-term financial security associated with traditional careers. When income becomes less predictable, financial planning becomes much more difficult. Families may hesitate to make large commitments like home purchases or long-term investments if their future earnings feel uncertain. Healthcare costs also play a major role in shaping middle-class financial stress. In many cases, a single medical emergency can disrupt years of careful financial planning. Even households with insurance may face significant out-of-pocket expenses, creating additional pressure on budgets that are already stretched thin by other rising costs. Education represents another area where middle-class expectations have shifted dramatically. College degrees are often seen as essential for career advancement, yet the cost of obtaining those degrees has increased substantially over time. Many students graduate with significant loan balances that follow them into adulthood. Those loan payments can delay other financial milestones such as buying homes, starting businesses, or building retirement savings. The combination of housing costs, student loans, healthcare expenses, and daily living costs creates a financial landscape that feels far more challenging than it did for earlier generations. Despite earning respectable incomes, many middle-class households feel as if they are running in place rather than moving forward. Progress becomes slower, and financial security feels harder to achieve. This growing gap between expectations and reality is what fuels much of the conversation around the middle-class crisis. The economic ladder still exists, but climbing it appears to require more effort, more income, and more financial risk than it once did. For many families, the idea of long-term stability now feels uncertain in ways that would have seemed surprising just a few decades ago. The traditional formula of education, employment, home ownership, and gradual wealth building no longer produces the same predictable results. Yet the middle class remains critically important to the functioning of the entire economy. Their spending, borrowing, and financial decisions influence everything from housing markets to retail sales and economic growth. Understanding why the middle class feels increasingly pressured requires looking beyond individual choices and examining the larger structural forces shaping the modern economy. Rising costs, changing labor markets, and expanding credit systems all interact in ways that reshape financial life. And as the financial pressure on middle-class households increases, another deeper pattern begins to emerge inside the economy. The middle class is not only struggling with higher costs, it is also experiencing a gradual shift in how wealth is distributed across society. Over the past several decades, a growing share of economic gains has flowed toward the top of the income distribution, while productivity and economic output have continued to expand. The benefits of that growth have not been evenly shared across all segments of the population. In many developed economies, the wealth held by the top percentage of households has increased much faster than the wealth accumulated by the middle class. This does not necessarily mean that middle-class incomes are falling dramatically, but it does mean their progress is slower compared to the rapid expansion of wealth at the top. When wealth grows unevenly, the economic landscape begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. Asset prices such as housing, stocks, and investments can rise rapidly when large amounts of capital flow into those markets. For households that already own those assets, rising prices can create significant gains in wealth over time. But for families that are still trying to enter those markets, the increasing cost of ownership can make it much harder to participate. Housing offers one of the clearest examples of this pattern. When property prices rise quickly, homeowners benefit because the value of their assets increases, but new buyers often face higher barriers to entry. As a result, younger middle-class households sometimes find themselves competing for homes that are becoming increasingly expensive relative to their income. This can delay home ownership or force families to take on larger mortgages than previous generations required. The same pattern appears in financial markets, where investment returns often benefit those who already possess significant capital. Households with large portfolios can accumulate wealth through asset appreciation, while families living primarily on wages may struggle to build similar financial momentum. This growing gap between income and asset ownership gradually reshapes the structure of the middle class. Some households continue building wealth through investments and property ownership, while others remain dependent primarily on wages that grow slowly over time. Inflation also plays a role in this dynamic, although its effects are often misunderstood. When prices rise across the economy, the purchasing power of wages declines unless incomes increase at the same pace. For middle-class households, this means everyday expenses such as groceries, transportation, and utilities gradually consume a larger share of their income. Even small increases in multiple categories can significantly affect a household budget when combined together. Over time, inflation can quietly erode the financial stability that families have worked to build. Savings lose purchasing power, while the cost of maintaining the same lifestyle continues to increase year after year. In response to these pressures, many households rely more heavily on credit to bridge temporary financial gaps. Credit cards, personal loans, and financing options allow families to maintain their spending patterns even when income growth slows. While credit can provide flexibility in the short term, it also introduces long-term financial obligations that must eventually be repaid. As debt levels increase, monthly payments begin consuming a larger portion of household income. This creates a situation where families may feel financially busy but not financially secure. Income arrives, bills are paid, and obligations are managed, yet the ability to accumulate significant savings becomes increasingly difficult. The result is a sense of financial stagnation that many middle-class households recognize today. Despite working consistently and earning reasonable incomes, progress toward long-term security can feel slow and uncertain. Another contributing factor to the middle-class crisis is the rising cost of services that were once considered affordable. Healthcare, childcare, and higher education have all become significantly more expensive relative to income over the past several decades. These costs are not optional for most families. Healthcare is essential for maintaining well-being. Childcare allows parents to participate in the workforce, and education is often seen as a necessary investment for future career opportunities. Because these services are essential, households must allocate significant portions of their income toward them regardless of how quickly their wages grow. This reduces the amount of money available for saving, investing, or building long-term financial resilience. At the same time, the structure of employment continues evolving in ways that create additional uncertainty for workers. Industries change rapidly, technology alters job requirements, and global competition reshapes labor markets across many sectors. While these changes can create new opportunities, they also introduce a level of unpredictability that makes long-term planning more difficult. A career path that once appeared stable may suddenly require new skills or adaptation to changing market conditions. This uncertainty encourages households to prioritize financial stability whenever possible. Stable employment becomes highly valuable when large financial commitments such as mortgages and loans depend on consistent income. However, maintaining that stability sometimes requires sacrifices in other areas of life. Workers may remain in jobs that provide reliable income even if those jobs offer limited advancement or personal satisfaction. This trade-off between stability and opportunity is one of the hidden consequences of the modern middle-class financial structure. Debt obligations and rising living costs create incentives that influence career decisions and personal risk-taking. From a broader economic perspective, the middle class continues playing a central role in supporting economic growth. Their consumption drives demand across industries, while their borrowing supports housing markets, automotive sales, and financial institutions. But the sustainability of this system depends on maintaining a balance between income growth and living costs. If the gap between the two becomes too wide, the financial pressure on households can eventually slow spending and economic momentum. Governments and policymakers attempt to manage this balance through various economic policies. Interest rates, tax policies, housing programs, and social services all influence the financial environment experienced by middle-class households. Lower interest rates, for example, can reduce the cost of borrowing and make mortgages or business loans more accessible. Higher interest rates, on the other hand, may slow borrowing but can also reduce inflationary pressure within the economy. These policy decisions often involve complex trade-offs because the same tools that stabilize the economy can also create unintended consequences over time. Encouraging borrowing may stimulate growth, but excessive debt can eventually introduce financial vulnerabilities. Despite these challenges, the middle class remains one of the most important pillars of economic stability. Their financial health influences consumer confidence, housing demand, business investment, and overall economic growth. When middle-class households feel secure, they are more likely to invest in homes, education, and long-term opportunities. That spending circulates through the economy and supports millions of jobs across multiple industries. But when financial pressure intensifies, spending patterns change quickly. Families delay purchases, reduce discretionary spending, and prioritize essential expenses over long-term investments. These behavioral shifts can ripple through the entire economy because middle-class consumption represents such a large portion of economic activity. A cautious middle class often leads to slower economic expansion. Understanding the middle-class crisis therefore requires looking beyond individual financial decisions. The issue is not simply about budgeting or personal discipline. It is about structural forces shaping the economic environment around households. Rising living costs, evolving labor markets, increasing reliance on credit, and uneven wealth growth all interact to create the financial pressures many families experience today. Each factor alone might be manageable, but together they produce a complex challenge. The middle class is not disappearing overnight, but its traditional foundation is changing in ways that make financial stability harder to achieve. The path that once led predictably toward prosperity now requires navigating a far more complicated economic landscape, and that is why the middle-class crisis has become one of the most important economic conversations of our time. It reflects deeper shifts in how wealth, opportunity, and financial security are distributed throughout the modern economy. For millions of households, the goal remains the same as it has always been: stability, opportunity, and the chance to build a better future. But achieving that goal now requires understanding an economic system that has become far more complex than it once appeared. Once you recognize these structural forces, the pressures facing the modern middle class begin to make much more sense. The struggle is not simply personal. It is part of a broader transformation occurring across the global economy, and the direction of that transformation will shape the financial lives of future generations in ways that are only beginning to become visible today.